Dateline, Atlanta, Georgia. Cool neighborhoods, possibly the best urban trail in the United States. The best metro system? Maybe not, but like the city itself, it's complicated. All of the beauty and the contradictions of Atlanta coming up next. This is CityNerd, weekly content on cities and transportation. Viewer-suggested topics always welcome, and this is another in my series where I travel to a city, film, and tell a story about what makes the city unique from the perspective of someone with the better part of a couple decades in planning and engineering. And let's jump right into downtown Atlanta, which has just such a weird hodgepodge of different things going on. There's the usual collection of late 20th century office buildings that don't have much relationship to the street, and that includes the America's Mart Wholesale Trade Center, not accessible to the general public, but kind of a whole city unto itself, complete with just a chaotic assortment of sky bridges. Centennial Olympic Park, home to a variety of tourist attractions, including a museum dedicated to the nutritional product the city is maybe best known for. I do like the downtown sports venue setup. State Farm Arena is a bit west of the heart of downtown, great MARTA access, and I'll talk more about MARTA in just a bit. Also, reasonably good likeness of the human highlight film out front, especially given that we've recently learned that it is difficult to do a competent job of sculpting NBA players. Mercedes-Benz Stadium, I think, did really well in my NFL and MLS videos. Not the most human-scaled interface with the street environment, but the urban fabric that connects it to downtown continues to be a work in progress. I believe what we're looking at is the ongoing construction of Centennial Yards, a mixed-use district with housing, lodging, and commercial that looks to be online, at least partially, in time for the 2026 World Cup. And the heart of downtown, in my opinion, the fairly popular district, narrow streets and beautiful building stock, developed, of course, before the advent of the automobile. You wish more of downtown Atlanta looked like this, but we're gonna have to get out of downtown to see places where the city really shines. And to do that, we're mostly gonna use MARTA, and there are a few different downtown stations to choose from, including Peachtree, which is very, very deep underground, but let's go to the heart of the system, 5 Points, the single station where all the MARTA lines converge. All of the stations have a reinforced concrete brutalist thing going on, which shouldn't be a surprise since Atlanta's rail system dates from the 1970s, just like the DC Metro and BART. Riding MARTA made me a little wistful though. All the federal funding that went into it was originally earmarked for Seattle, but in 1968, only a bit over 50% of King County voted in favor of putting up the local match, and a 60% supermajority was required. It's just democracy in action. Anyway, riding MARTA every day I was here, my observation was the service itself was surprisingly good. If you're in the core of the system, the trains run every 7.5 minutes most of the day on weekdays, sometimes more frequently and sometimes less depending on time of day, and more like every 10 minutes on weekends. I was there during the week and the schedule checks out because I rarely had to wait more than 3 or 4 minutes for a train. So the service seems good, but you'll notice that these stations are not insanely busy, and I think this has been true for the entire history of the system. There's always been the question of why a broader segment of Atlanta's population doesn't ride MARTA, and the reason often cited is racism, and I suspect there is some of that, but also the system doesn't necessarily go to the places people want to go efficiently, and often, even when it does, it's an elevated or deep underground station that involves convoluted, time-consuming paths to get to the platform. Related, the land use around most of the outlying stations isn't going to generate high ridership either. Just going east, for example, it's really a series of concrete monoliths situated within enormous park and ride lots that aren't even that close to the centers of the neighborhoods they propose to serve. Inman Park, for example, is a great old streetcar suburb with a decent amount of density and walkability, but the MARTA station isn't really near that part of the neighborhood. The upshot is, this is a system that's around 45 years old and still doesn't feel like it's meeting anywhere near its potential. And it's probably why, as you travel into downtown from the east and cross over I-85, it is just jam-packed with drivers. In fact, I've been to a lot of cities since I started doing this channel and really paying attention to these things. And I have to say, Atlanta probably had consistently the worst traffic I've seen in any city I've been to. You know what though? Just keep on adding more lanes and neglecting transit. It's working out great. The traffic is even bad in Midtown, which is probably the best example of where new density and infill has actually been built around rail stations. There's an interesting mix of original streetcar-era building stock and new high-rise infill, and you can really see the way Midtown has taken shape just by using the Street View time slider to go back a couple years. There are times when you're walking around Atlanta where you feel like, this is it, this has to be the most modern American city. It's young, it's educated, the music and cultural scene has been massively influential, but Midtown is one of those places that reminds you this is an old city with a very complicated history, which I'll come back to, but there are also places where Midtown Atlanta feels a bit like Midtown Manhattan, right up to and including Piedmont Park, which feels a bit like Central Park, partly because a lot of it was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted's kids. Midtown was Atlanta's original streetcar destination, I'm told. And I believe it, but here's the thing I could go on about at excruciating length for just about any American city. The impact of a vanished streetcar system on a city's urban form that's persisted decades after the rail was all paved over, to the point where all the neighborhoods where the streetcars once ran are now the most desirable places to live. Let's start with Inman Park, where you actually do have an old streetcar node near the MARTA station, and a trolley barn which has been preserved and converted into an event space. Again, not much density, even though we're close to rail transit, and the evidence of how car-dependent the nearby land uses are is pretty apparent. Nearly all of the residential near the MARTA station is single-family detached, and some pretty amazing single-family detached for that matter, and that's fine. Nobody's proposing to eminent domain these homes and build 5/1s, but there is a lot of underutilized land around the station too. Just saying. The density that does exist in Inman Park is really over toward the Beltline and Highland Avenue, which, take a wild guess, was a corridor on the streetcar system. And there is a lot of newer density here, but it's nowhere near where MARTA Heavy Rail runs. And that's going to be a theme throughout here. Candler Park, cool old streetcar node at Oakdale and McGlendon. Very charming, but pretty low density otherwise, and there's apparently a fight going on over whether to make the zoning even more restrictive. Seems questionable. There's no doubt the neighborhoods here take a lot of pride in their unique identities, and I think there's something to be said for that. But I think too often people consider neighborhood identity to be antithetical to building new density. And Reynoldstown is a spot where those things feel like they're maybe balanced a little better. Cabbagetown, at the southern terminus of the Eastern Beltline segment, very charming and very colorful. Little 5 Points was a node where streetcar lines once converged, now maybe a bit of a mixed bag. Really cool, diverse mix of commercial storefronts on Euclid Avenue and on Moreland Avenue, but the character of these two streets is very different. If I pan from Euclid to Moreland, see if you can guess which one was built around a streetcar line and which one was not. This is a tough one, so I'll give you some time. Here's one that's a bit different. Glenwood Park. It has a much newer, and by that I mean new urbanist feel to it. The housing types and the way the streets are laid out looks old, but you don't have to go too far back in time to find this used to be heavy industrial land. I'm not always the hugest fan of new urbanism. It always feels a bit too focused on the look and feel while still being too car dependent. I mean, this is a lot of off-street parking, but honestly, this kind of development and level of density would be a big improvement in a lot of our cities. Not really a fan of private parks in urban neighborhoods though. Get over yourself. And finally, I did wrestle with the idea of getting out of town and hitting the Atlanta suburbs where there's just a ton going on. But as you can tell, I had my hands full with the city proper, so I only made it to Decatur, which is one of those suburbs that shows up in my good lists from time to time, and I definitely wanted some B-roll. And it is very cute, as advertised, and I think most of this is legit historic urban fabric. The streetcar did run to downtown Decatur, and the architecture definitely has that feel to it. And this is a spot where they ran MARTA rail underground and located the station almost exactly where the historic streetcar ran. And this is really what you want. You've got the legacy pedestrian-oriented urban form, and you've got the modern heavy rail infrastructure co-located. It shouldn't be that hard of a concept, and downtown Decatur is a great example. I'll give you a bonus Decatur neighborhood, Oakhurst, and this node at Oakview and Eastlake, which was also a node on Atlanta's streetcar network, if it wasn't obvious. Really beautiful stuff, and again, you can see why the city of Decatur as a whole often shows up on my good suburbs lists, because this feels much more like an inner city neighborhood. Let's go back to Atlanta. This is West Midtown, which is west of Midtown. And the streetcar did run on Howell Mill Road, although so much of the development here is new, it's hard to recognize it as a historic transit corridor. This is also where you'll find the West Side Provisions District, which I kind of slagged in a video a couple weeks ago, but I can be kind of judgy like that. The reality is, people like bar studios, athleisure wear, and trendy, expensive fast food. Who am I to critique people's life choices? There's also a massive amount of housing infill going in on Northside Drive, which runs parallel to Howell Mill, and it should go without saying is not a legacy streetcar corridor. Food options, though, pretty solid. Also part of West Midtown and just a bit north, Atlantic Station, where there's also dense residential, and I feel kind of bad that I was so hard on West Side Provisions because Atlantic Station is a textbook lifestyle center, constructed over a literal crater of parking. Everywhere you walk around Atlantic Station, there are these little portals where people pop up and down to get to their cars and back. It's a little dystopian, but you can't really blame people for driving here because it's a pretty long way to the nearest MARTA station. The other thing is, Atlanta is very racially diverse, and I always think of lifestyle centers as being very white-coated. But just to give you an idea, when I stopped in to get a beer at Yard House, because that's how I roll, I was the only white dude in the place, which I just find pretty comical. Let's go back to actual Midtown, because you can't really talk about the central part of Atlanta without talking about Georgia Tech. And I'm going to start with Tech Square, which is a part of the campus that creeps over to the east of I-85 into Midtown. The full name of the school is the Georgia Institute of Technology, and this location does really emphasize the technology part, which apparently includes delivery robots. And I don't know if you've seen these things operate before, but given the pace this thing moves at, your Chipotle order or whatever's inside the thing is practically guaranteed to be incubating some pathogen or another by the time it shows up at your door. Okay, not literally, I don't want to get sued. But honestly, this robot delivery vehicle is the worst pedestrian I've ever seen in my life. I have gotten rides in Waymos this year. I know robots can drive, so maybe this just goes to show how much more challenging walking in our cities is than driving, because you gotta have a little more awareness and assertiveness if you're gonna try to cross a street. I must have been camped out here for at least 10 minutes before this little guy worked up the courage to go. And when it finally gets to the other side, it just totally biffs it on the curb cut. I get that urban environments are complex and chaotic, but I expect better from our robot overlords. The 5th Street Bridge is about as pedestrian friendly as a bridge over a 15-lane freeway gets, and then you're basically on campus. I would never call a college campus truly urbanist because it's a specialized environment geared for a particular kind of person in a very particular phase of their life. But Georgia Tech is really well connected to some of the best parts of the city. I'm here in mid-October and the vibes are pretty immaculate. The students are still in that halcyon first few weeks before research papers and exams start piling up. You've still got some optimism that your football team is actually going to be good. Really, none of the inevitable misery has started to grab hold yet. Even after it does, though, the bad memories always seem to melt away. And it's almost trite to say it at this point, but no matter where you go from here, your time in college is often fondly remembered as a time when you could walk or bike wherever you needed to, have chance meetings with acquaintances while you're out just walking around, and you can live near all the places you want to be. Related, I didn't do a big public meetup this time, but I did get together with the cool kids from the graduate planning program at Georgia Tech. They dragged me down to the new Leon White development in the West End district, south of downtown. Fun spot if you're a fan of breweries and distilleries. Not a super fun spot if you're a fan of transit accessibility. It's a 20-minute walk from MARTA and sidewalk conditions aren't the best. Also accessible from the southern segment of the Beltline, which is a bit more promising, but isn't connected up with the much more developed eastern segment yet, and we'll get to that in just a minute. First though, a customary reminder to click on the stuff. The bell is particularly important if you don't want me to disappear from your feed. All the websites that you can connect on, I took the Bird app off the list because it's just kind of irredeemable at this point. Oh, I do want to give advance warning. I'm putting down a placeholder for an event on Friday, January 31st in New York City. And fingers crossed, if this comes off, it's going to be incredible. So East Coast folks, be on the lookout for further information, and patrons will get first crack at tickets for this mystery event. Let's continue with the Beltline. There's a sizable gap between the segment in the West End and the segment that basically starts here at the scramble signal on the north end of the Krog Street Tunnel. The tunnel itself, I kind of feel like this is the sort of thing right-wingers object to when they talk about cities being dirty, crime-infested hellholes. But stuff like the Krog Street Tunnel seems very intentional. You almost have to have this kind of almost staged grittiness to offset the newness and the sterile feeling you have once you cross the street into the heart of the Beltline. The last thing about this location, why is there not a MARTA infill station? Because it is just crazy busy with people all the time, and there's a ton of dense development going in around the Beltline. Infill station locations actually have been identified both here and in the West End near the Lee and White development, so it's not as if no one realizes it's an obvious need. So let's go to the most fully developed segment of the Beltline, just north of the tunnel. It's hard to know exactly how to characterize the Beltline and what to compare it to. When I covered the Midtown Greenway in Minneapolis, a lot of people in the comments brought up the Beltline as a comparison, but the Midtown Greenway is a bit more of a straight-up transportation facility, and it's in a cut below grade. The Beltline, by contrast, has elements of urban design and landscape architecture and public art that make it reminiscent of a linear park like the High Line in New York. But here you'll see people running and rollerblading and biking for exercise and transportation, and you don't really see the High Line used that way. So it's kind of a hybrid active transportation facility and linear park. A quick observation about these urban trails that are on old rail corridors, and I noticed this in the DeQuindre cut in Detroit too, is the different ways they try to pretty up overpasses. I've been thinking a lot about what it is people are talking about when they say cities are dirty and unattractive, and I feel like roadway infrastructure and the debris and grime that are a byproduct of thousands of vehicles passing through every day is that thing. But neither the DeQuindre cut or even the Midtown Greenway have the kind of explosion of housing and retail this segment of the Beltline has. You definitely feel like you're being encouraged to go on apartment tours as you walk the corridor, minding your own business. The other thing is, there's nothing about the Beltline that screams lifestyle center, so I won't make that comparison, but it does feature a lot of the common tropes of present-day American urbanism. I kind of want to make a video along the lines of, what do we put in commercial storefronts anymore, now that everyone buys stuff online and has food door-dashed? The Beltline kind of answers a lot of those questions circa 2024. And on the theme of tropes of modern urbanism, can we talk about food halls? Because this trail segment is anchored by two of them. And honestly, I ran into them all over the city, and I just think at this point, it's completely out of hand. The first one is the Krog Street Market down near the tunnel. And look, I get that there are potentially good things about food halls. They can be incubators for emerging chefs and restaurateurs, like a stepping stone between a food cart and a full-blown brick and mortar location. But some of what's here is just chain establishments. And Ponce City Market, which isn't just a food hall, it has offices and apartments and some other bells and whistles. But the food hall is the most prominent thing if you're coming in off the Beltline. Like, all I'm saying is, if you're dining with other people and you all have to stand in line in different places and your food is all ready at different times, and you have to go to a completely different location to stand in line for a beer, it just isn't my favorite dining experience. I'm a grump, sorry. But I can't hate on Ponce City Market too much. It's actually a pretty cool adaptive reuse project. It's an old Sears building, kind of like Midtown Market in Minneapolis. Kind of like the Starbucks headquarters in Seattle. I get so many video ideas when I do these city visits, so I think next up is top 10 department store adaptive reuses. Like, for better or worse, it's gonna be a watershed moment in American urbanism when the Herald Square Macy's in New York gets converted into an 11-story food hall / bar studio / axe throwing establishment with luxury penthouse apartments. Okay, so I'm playing up my grouchiness a little. The easy and uncharitable thing to say here is that everything around the Beltline feels a bit antiseptic and bougie, a little too Instagrammable. But that's the reality of urban design today, and being shiny and clean is just the nature of new things. And everything has to be new at some point. So sure, there's higher end stuff here, but there's also extremely normal middle-brow stuff hidden in plain sight, like a Kroger's. So calling it bougie is a bit of a misplaced criticism, I think. And it's glaringly obvious that people love the Beltline. They're out being active and enjoying public space. It's fantastic for people watching. Every city in the US would probably love to have something like this. I do have to address one other thing. There's a bit of a battle of yard signs going on regarding the future of the Beltline. My understanding is the current configuration is really just a placeholder for future rail transit, and everything was planned and engineered with right-of-way and geometry to accommodate what would probably be an at-grade streetcar, almost more of a European tram from the renderings I've seen. I think the problem is the Beltline as a linear park, an active transportation corridor, and probably most importantly, a development catalyst, has been so massively successful that a lot of people are thinking, why mess with what's working? And I get that, but my thing is, between there not being infill MARTA stations that connect and no other solid transit options, people are driving from all over the Atlanta metro area to get here because it is so popular. So there's a bigger question embedded in here of how long is Atlanta going to keep doubling down on car dependence when driving here is such an obviously terrible experience and just getting worse all the time. Let's head back toward downtown as we start wrapping this thing up. Fourth Ward Park, just west of the Beltline and south of Ponce City Market. Pretty first-rate urban design, but my understanding is, besides being a great public space, a lot of it is designed for environmentally friendly stormwater retention. And there's a long history of flooding in this location. So the park is actually doing multiple things to make the neighborhood literally more livable. And developers have responded by building just a crap ton of housing units. Last stop, the Sweet Auburn neighborhood, part of which was raised over to build downtown freeways. I talked about that in last week's video, so I won't dwell on it here, but it's similar to the story of the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul if you watched that video. And the state DOT now pays homage to all that it destroyed with a mural under a freeway overpass and some signage that acknowledges all the establishments that don't exist anymore. The Martin Luther King Jr. Historical Park is also in Sweet Auburn, and I didn't take a lot of photos here because it felt weird. In my mind, it's a sacred place. You know, every time I mention redlining or systemic racism in one of my videos, which is actually probably less frequent than it should be, I get comments from people saying that I'm just virtue signaling. Like, for a certain type of person, there's no such thing as actual virtue, only virtue signaling. There's no such thing as actual social justice, only annoying social justice warriors. As if you're a white person, it's simply not possible that you could authentically care about, say, the human capacity for evil and cruelty, which is, unfortunately, inextricable from the history of this country. And I wish I was talking about things that are all in the past, but post-election, it's pretty clear that a lot of the same things are still in play today. They always were. I don't like to end things on a dismal note, but this week is tough. So at the risk of being white dude who co-opts Dr. King's words, I'm just gonna do it anyway. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I'm having trouble feeling that today because the arc seems longer than ever, but if Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a man who sacrificed everything to make this a more just world, could himself believe those words, then I'm on board. And that's all I've got. Thanks for joining today, and thanks as always to the patrons for the direct support and a lot of words of encouragement over the past week. It means a lot. This was a patron-funded trip, and I do hope to do more in 2025 since I think we're entering a period where our cities are going to need more attention than ever. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then, and just hang tough, everyone.